You know how it is in relationships, right?
Mm.
Sometimes just one little thing happens and suddenly things spiral.
Oh, absolutely. Misunderstandings, hurt feelings, they seem to, well, pop up all too easily.
So how do we build those connections that are, strong enough to actually handle those bumps?
Hmm.
Is there a secret?
Aha, well, maybe not a secret, but a key idea is something called psychological flexibility.
Psychological flexibility.
Ah.
Okay. What does that mean in practice?
Think of it like being mentally agile, sort of nimble in your relationships. It's the ability to step back from your first gut reaction to
Okay.
see things from different angles, except that maybe there's more than one way to look at a situation, even when you're feeling, really emotional about it.
And then acting based on that bigger picture.
Exactly. Acting in a way that lines up with what's important to you, your values, rather than just reacting on impulse.
Mental agility in relationships. I like that. So how do we get more agile?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. We're focusing on a really powerful tool for building that flexibility.
Which is
Identifying and, more importantly, challenging these mental habits we call cognitive distortions.
cognitive distortions. Okay, unpack that for us. What are they?
Basically, they're these unhelpful, often pretty inaccurate thinking patterns, habits of thought that can really twist how we see our partner's actions or what we think they're intending.
Like mental traps?
Yeah, exactly like mental traps. They distort reality, usually making things seem more negative than they actually are.
So it's that little voice inside that always jumps to the worst possible conclusion.
That's a big part of it, yes. And when we're talking relationships, these distortions, they fuel conflict that isn't really about the thing that happened.
Right.
They make us react way more intensely, emotionally than the situation warrants. And over time, they can seriously damage trust.
How so?
Well, we start seeing problems that aren't really there, or we blow tiny issues way, way out of proportion. It eats away at the foundation.
Sounds like something everyone probably does now and then, though.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally human to have these kinds of thoughts sometimes. The real issue is when these distorted ways of thinking become our default setting.
Our automatic go-to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When they're routine.
Right.
That's when they really start contributing to bigger problems like that emotional distance or, resentment simmering away, arguments that just go in circles.
Okay. So, what's our mission for this deep dive? What should you, listening, hope to get out of this?
Well, our aim today is really to shine a light on some of the most common cognitive distortions that sneak into our relationships.
Make them visible.
Precisely. By making them more visible, we hope you can start recognizing them in your own thinking. And the ultimate goal, to help you choose more balanced, more realistic thoughts.
Which leads to better communication.
Better communication, deeper intimacy. Yeah.
That sounds incredibly useful. So, where specific thinking traps are we going to explore?
We've picked 10 common ones.
Yeah.
We'll look at all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, catastrophizing, personalization, mind reading.
Okay, halfway there.
Then discounting the positive, emotional reasoning, should statements, labeling, and mislabeling. And we'll finish with fortune telling.
Wow, okay, that's quite a list. Let's dive right in. First up, all or nothing thinking. What's that about?
All or nothing thinking, sometimes people call it black and white thinking. It's seeing things in extremes, either.
The middle ground.
Exactly. No shades of gray. You interpret things in these really rigid categories, totally ignoring the spectrum of possibilities that usually exists.
So it's like either it's a total success or an absolute failure, nothing in between.
Precisely. And it applies everywhere. Like you might think, if I don't finish everything on my to-do list today, the whole day was a complete waste.
Oh, my presentation wasn't perfect, so it was a total disaster.
Right. You get it.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly stressful. It just ignores any progress you actually made.
It really does. This kind of rigid thinking just oversimplifies everything complex. It overlooks effort, small steps forward. It just focuses on the extreme outcome.
And at least it's...
Well, unsurprisingly, a lot of unnecessary stress, frustration, and some really harsh self-criticism.
And you're constantly set up for disappointment. Right?
Yeah.
Because perfection is impossible. If it's not 100%, it counts as 0.
And exactly. You're always minimizing the small wins or even just the effort involved. And over time, that chips away at your self-esteem. It fuels negative feelings like anxiety, maybe even burnout.
Why do we do it, though?
Often it comes from a deep need for certainty, maybe, or a fear of not being good enough. Black and white thinking gives this kind of false sense of clarity in a world that's actually pretty messy.
Okay, so how does this all or nothing stuff specifically mess with our relationship?
It can put a huge strain on things. It creates these really unrealistic expectations for friends, partners.
Like expecting them to be perfect.
Yeah, or always available, always understanding. When they inevitably fall short because they're human, you feel disproportionately let down, maybe even angry, and compromise. Forget it.
Why is compromise so hard with this thinking?
Because you struggle to see those gray areas where a middle ground could exist. You see your way as the only right way.
You mentioned polarizing dynamics earlier. What's that?
That's when we start seeing people as either all good or all bad. So if someone we care about messes up or disappoints us once,
Suddenly they're unreliable or uncaring.
right, we completely forget all the good history, all the positive stuff. This extreme view just escalates conflicts like crazy and makes forgiveness really, really tough.
And perfectionist expectations. Sounds related.
Very related. Applying that all or nothing standard to yourself, I must always be the perfect partner, or to your partner, they must always meet this impossible ideal. It just guarantees disappointment and a feeling of failure.
And that difficulty compromising you talked about.
Comes straight from the black and white view. If there's only one right way to handle a fight or solve a problem in your mind, finding common ground is almost impossible. You can't be open to your partner's view.
Okay, that really paints a picture of how damaging that one can be. Let's move to the next one. Overgeneralization. What's the key idea there?
Overgeneralization is basically drawing huge conclusions from very limited negative evidence, taking one bad experience and treating it like it's this unbreakable pattern that's going to happen again and again.
Can you give a general life example?
Sure. Let's say you don't get a promotion you wanted at work.
I would-
Someone overgeneralizing might immediately think, I'm just useless, I'm no good at anything. They take that one setback and make it about their entire worth.
Wow. So they completely ignore any past successes or skills in other areas?
Completely. It really kills your confidence. It stops you from trying new things because you've already decided, based on one event, that you're doomed to fail. It's like putting a limit on yourself.
What drives that? Fear of failing again.
Often, yes. Fear of repeated failure, or maybe a really deep-seated belief that you're just not adequate.
So how does this overgeneralizing show up in relationships?
It can lead to really unfair prejudice and misunderstanding. Say you had a bad experience with one past partner who had a certain trait.
You start assuming everyone like them is the same.
Exactly. You generalize those negative things onto new people, which obviously erodes trust before it even starts and makes it hard to form new, healthy connections. You lose openness.
You mentioned stereotyping as linked to this.
Yeah, it's a direct result. If you have a few bad encounters with people from, say, a certain group or background, you might start making sweeping negative assumptions about everyone in that group. That's stereotyping in action, fueled by overgeneralization.
And relationship pessimism. That sounds pretty bleak.
It really is. If someone's been through a very painful breakup, for instance.
They might think all future relationships will end the same way.
Precisely. They overgeneralize that one painful experience and assume history will just repeat itself. This can lead to isolation, a fear of getting close, maybe avoiding relationships altogether.
It sounds like it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. How does that work?
Well, if you constantly expect relationships to fail because of your past,
You act in ways that make it happen.
exactly. You might be more defensive, more suspicious, less willing to be vulnerable or invest emotionally. And that behavior itself can create the distance or problems you were afraid of in the first place.
Interesting that you noted it's more common in people with anxiety or depression.
Yes. Research shows a clear link. For someone already struggling, overgeneralizing negative events can really magnify those feelings of anxiety, low self-worth, pessimism. It becomes a tough cycle.
You used a driving example hitting every red light. Tell us more about that.
Right. So you have one really annoying drive where it feels like you hit every single red light.
We've all been there.
Totally. And in that frustration, you might think, ugh, I always get stopped by every red light in this town. Logically, you know it's not true. But the feeling makes it seem true in that moment. It's a common, usually harmless, everyday overgeneralization.
So what are the signs we should look out for? How do we know if we are doing this?
Key signs include seeing any single negative event as proof of a never-ending pattern, using words like always or never a lot. This always happens, I never get it right.
Okay.
Assuming one failure means ongoing failure in that whole area, noticing your negative self-talk getting worse, and just that general feeling of, I can't do anything right.
Okay, so if we recognize that pattern in ourselves, what can we actually do about it?
Well, several things. First, like we just said, just becoming aware when it's happening. That self-awareness is huge.
Mindfulness helps there.
Mindfulness is great. Journaling too. Writing things down can help you spot the patterns, see what triggers the overgeneralizing thoughts.
It helps you step outside your own head a bit.
Exactly. Then the crucial part is to really look at those strong negative thoughts. Question them. Ask yourself, is this really true? 100% true.
Is there any evidence against it?
Yes. What would someone else say about this situation? Actively challenge the always and never. And consciously, deliberately remember times you did succeed or times the bad thing didn't happen. Focus on the counter evidence.
Bring in the positive experiences to fight the negative generalization.
So that's the core of it. And remember, as we mentioned, if overgeneralization is tied to underlying anxiety, addressing that anxiety through therapy or self-care can also make a big difference here.
That makes sense. Okay, distortion number 3, catastrophizing. This one sounds dramatic.
It often feels dramatic. Catastrophizing is essentially expecting the absolute worst-case scenario, even when there's zero realistic evidence for it.
Blowing things way out of proportion.
Exactly. Taking a relatively small negative event and exaggerating its potential impact until you're imagining some kind of, well, catastrophe, often a very unlikely one.
You had that example about a delayed train earlier.
Right. So the train is slightly delayed. The catastrophizing mind jumps to, this delay means I miss my vital job interview.
Okay.
Which means I won't get the job, which means I'll end up homeless. It's this runaway train of negative, improbable predictions, often driven by a high sensitivity to potential threats and difficulty judging real risks.
Wow, that must create so much unnecessary stress.
A huge amount. It generates intense anxiety for no good reason. And it can lead us to make really impulsive decisions based on these imagined disasters instead of calmly assessing the actual, probably minor, situation.
So how does this play out specifically in relationships?
In relationships, it magnifies minor issues massively. It causes panic and tension where none is needed. Partner is a few minutes late texting back.
The catastrophizer thinks they're dead in a ditch, or furious, or breaking up.
Exactly. Those kinds of immediate worst-case jumps.
Overreacting to small things constantly must really strain the connection. Create drama.
It really does. And if you're always expecting disaster, you might become overly controlling, trying to prevent these imagined bad things from happening.
Trying to manage everything.
Right, which can really suffocate your partner's autonomy and kill the spontaneity that makes relationships feel alive and healthy.
You listed heightened anxiety as a result. Seems obvious.
It's a direct consequence. Living constantly braced for doom in the relationship, that takes a massive toll on your mental health, leads to chronic anxiety.
What about avoidance of risks? How does that connect?
If you're terrified of catastrophic outcomes, you'll naturally avoid taking risks in the relationship, even potentially good risks like being more vulnerable or trying new things together. That fear limits growth, both personal and relational.
And the over-reliance on reassurance you mentioned. Sounds draining for the partner.
It absolutely can be. If you're constantly catastrophizing, you might constantly seek reassurance from your partner to calm those anxieties, even temporarily.
A little reassurance is okay, but
a constant, overwhelming need for it, that's exhausting for the other person. It can create an unhealthy dependence rather than a balanced partnership.
okay, catastrophizing. Got it. Let's move to personalization. What's the core idea here?
Personalization is when you take way too much responsibility for things that are actually outside your control. It's attributing external events directly to yourself, even when it makes no sense.
Leading to guilt and self-blame.
Loads of it. Unwarranted guilt and self-blame. Often driven by a need to feel in control, maybe, or believing your worth is tied to external outcomes.
You had that example about a friend canceling plans.
Right. Friend cancels coffee. Someone personalizing immediately thinks, oh, I must be me, I'm boring, or they don't really like me.
Instead of thinking the friend might just be busy or sick.
Exactly. They internalize this external event as a direct reflection on their own value or likability, taking blame that isn't theirs.
So it distorts your sense of accountability.
Completely. You take on responsibility that has nothing to do with you. In relationships, this shows up as constant self-blame for conflicts or negative things, leading to guilt, inadequacy, shame.
Sounds like it could really block empathy too.
It does. If you're always focused inward on how external stuff reflects your supposed flaws, it's hard to truly tune into your partner's actual feelings or needs. Your focus is on you, not them.
And you mentioned a constant fear of rejection.
Yes, because if you personalize everything, even neutral interactions can feel like potential rejection. That underlying fear makes it really hard to be authentic, open, vulnerable in the relationship.
You also listed blame and guilt as a major fallout.
Definitely. Taking responsibility for things that aren't your fault creates this awful cycle of blaming yourself, feeling guilty. It's a heavy emotional burden that strains intimacy and just breeds negativity.
What about difficulty accepting constructive criticism? How does personalization cause that?
Well, if you tend to personalize any feedback, even helpful constructive feedback, feels like a personal attack.
An attack on your character or worth.
Exactly. So it makes it incredibly hard to actually learn and grow from feedback within the relationship.
And lastly, assuming negative intentions.
Yeah, because if everything external relates back to you, you start assuming other people's actions are deliberately aimed at you negatively. Partner seems quiet, you assume they're mad at you, not just tired or stressed about work. Leads to needless conflict.
Okay, personalization covered. Next up, mind reading. This sounds like a recipe for trouble.
Oh, it really is. Mind reading is basically assuming you know exactly what other people are thinking or feeling without any actual proof.
Just guessing, essentially.
Worse than guessing, it's assuming you know. And this inevitably leads to misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and strained relationships. Maybe driven by a lack of trust or over-relying on intuition without checking it out.
You had that example about a meeting where people weren't smiling.
Right. You're in a meeting, some colleagues seem quiet or aren't smiling. The mind reader instantly concludes they hate my ideas or they think I'm incompetent.
Creates tension, self-doubt.
Totally. Lowers your self-esteem, all based on an unverified assumption about someone else's internal state.
So making assumptions without checking.
Yeah.
How does that play out in close relationships?
It creates huge communication barriers. If
Right.
you assume you know your partner's upset because they're quiet, instead of just asking.
You react based on your assumption.
Exactly, leading to misunderstandings and fights about things that might not even be true.
Sounds like it would destroy trust over time.
Absolutely. It undermines open, honest communication. If your partner constantly assumes they know your thoughts, instead of asking, how can you feel truly seen, understood, or trusted, it damages the core.
You mentioned misinterpretation as a key outcome.
Yes, because you're just guessing about their inner world, and guesses are often wrong. You misinterpret their words, actions, intentions, causing conflict and hurt.
And the failure to seek clarification seems obvious if you think you already know.
Right. Why ask if you're convinced you already have the answer? This lack of checking in lets small misunderstandings fester and grow into much bigger problems.
And finally, building resentment from these assumptions.
Yeah, because if you keep assuming negative motives or feelings from your partner without checking, you start building resentment based on these perceived hurts that might be totally inaccurate, creates huge emotional distance.
Yikes. Mind reading is definitely hazardous. Okay, let's shift to discounting the positive. What's the core of this one?
Discounting the positive is when we consistently minimize, dismiss, or explain away positive things, experiences, achievements, good qualities. It's like having a mental filter that only lets the negative stuff through.
Leading to a skewed self-view.
Very skewed, overly negative self-perception, and usually lower self-esteem. Maybe driven by a fear of acknowledging your own worth or feeling like good things are undeserved flukes.
You use the example of acing a project, but explaining it away.
Right. You work hard, succeed brilliantly, but instead of feeling proud, you say, oh, it was just luck, or anyone could have done it, or it wasn't that big a deal.
You don't acknowledge your own skill or effort.
Exactly. And doing that repeatedly really feeds into things like imposter syndrome, feeling like a fraud, and it just tanks your confidence.
So how does this discounting habit show up in relationships?
It really sucks the joy out of things. If you or your partner constantly fail to acknowledge or celebrate good things, successes, kind gestures, positive interactions,
It leads to feeling unappreciated.
deeply unappreciated, like your efforts don't matter, aren't seen, aren't valued by the other person.
So I think it creates a generally negative vibe in the relationship.
It absolutely does. Always downplaying the good stuff fosters a negative atmosphere. It hinders growth, connection, intimacy, and just impacts everyone's well-being.
And you mentioned it directly undermines self-esteem.
Makes sense, right. Constantly minimizing positives, whether yours or your partner's, reinforces negative thought patterns and lowers your sense of self-worth within the relationship.
What about the failure to acknowledge efforts of a partner? Seems common.
Very common. Partner does something thoughtful, makes an effort, and the other person just brushes it off, takes it for granted, doesn't really see the care behind it. Over time, the person making the effort feels invisible, unvalued.
And it probably makes expressing gratitude really hard, too.
Exactly. If you're busy discounting all the positive inputs, it's tough to genuinely feel and express gratitude, which is so vital for a positive, appreciative relationship.
Okay, discounting the positive, a real joy killer. Moving on. Emotional reasoning. What's the key idea here?
Emotional reasoning is believing your feelings are facts. That if you feel something strongly, it must be objectively true, regardless of any
So
evidence.
decisions get based on feelings, not logic.
Entirely. Decisions and beliefs are driven by the intensity of the emotion, not a balanced look at the situation or the facts. Can be driven by difficulty telling feelings from facts or just trusting emotions above all else.
You had that example about feeling anxious about public speaking.
Right. You feel intensely anxious before a speech. Emotional reasoning says, I feel so anxious, therefore I must be terrible at this and I will fail.
Even if you've done well before or prepared.
Doesn't matter, the feeling becomes the truth. The anxiety dictates the belief about your ability.
So the feeling is treated as undeniable proof.
Exactly. And that obviously hinders problem solving and rational thought. In relationships, it means letting your current emotion, anger, fear, whatever, completely dictate how you see your partner and how you react. Leads to impulsive actions, misunderstandings.
Sounds like it would make resolving conflicts almost impossible.
Extremely difficult. If emotions are the only truth, how can you step back, look objectively, have a constructive conversation? Feelings just override everything.
You mentioned misinterpretation of feelings as a result. How does that work?
Well, believing emotions facts leads to misinterpreting your own feelings and maybe more damagingly, your partner's intentions. Feeling suspicious means you believe they are untrustworthy, even with zero proof. Causes huge distress and conflict.
And the decision-making, based on emotions alone.
Relying only on how you feel right now without thinking logically or practically leads to impulsive choices you often regret later. Reacting purely out of anger or fear, for example, can cause real damage.
And the difficulty in problem solving, you noted.
Yes, because when strong emotions are constantly blocking rational thought, you can't get a clear view of the actual problem or figure out effective, fair solutions together.
Okay, emotional reasoning sounds chaotic for relationships. Let's tackle should statements. These sound inherently critical.
They often carry that weight, yes. Should statements involve imposing these rigid, often unrealistic expectations on yourself, your partner, or the relationship itself?
Like rules.
Exactly, like strict, non-negotiable rules. And this almost always leads to guilt, inadequacy, frustration when the shoulds aren't met. It fosters a negative, judgmental mindset, maybe driven by a need for control, rigid personal rules, or internalizing societal pressure, sometimes called shoulding on yourself or others.
You use the example of feeling you should always be cheerful.
Right. If you have this internal rule, I should always be happy, then when you naturally feel sad or frustrated, you feel guilty, like you failed.
You judge yourself for normal emotions.
Precisely. It creates this harsh inner critic and stops you from just experiencing the full, healthy range of human feelings. You're saying part of your experience is wrong.
So how do these shoulds play out in our relationships?
They create enormous tension, setting up these unspoken, often impossible expectations. It just makes people feel constantly judged, like they're walking on eggshells, never measuring up.
The rigidity kills flexibility.
Totally. It hinders understanding, compromise, acceptance.
You listed unrealistic expectations as a direct result. Makes sense.
Absolutely. Imposing rules like, my partner should always know what I need without me saying it. That's impossible. It just guarantees disappointment and resentment for everyone.
And the increased judgment and criticism.
Yes, because shoulds imply a right and wrong way to be or act. This makes it hard to accept your partner's differences, their personality, needs, ways of doing things. Leads to more criticism, less acceptance.
And the possibility of control struggles?
Because shoulds are rules you're imposing, they often lead to power struggles. Each person tries to enforce their own shoulds on the other, creating conflict and feeling controlled instead of partnered.
Okay, should sound stifling. Next, labeling and mislabeling. How is this different from just describing behavior?
Big difference. Labeling is assigning a global, usually negative label to someone or yourself based on just one or a few specific actions.
Taking one mistake and making it define the whole person.
Exactly. It massively oversimplifies complex people into broad, negative categories, distorts self-image, kills empathy, might stem from needing quick judgments or seeing people as fixed.
You use the example of forgetting a friend's birthday.
Right, you forget the birthday, you feel bad, but labeling jumps to, I'm a terrible friend. That one mistake becomes your entire identity, ignoring all the good things about the friendship. It's overly judgmental, bad for mental health.
So it's not just I messed up, it's I am the mess up.
Yeah, perfectly put. And in relationships, this oversimplification leads to constant misunderstanding and unfair judgment. You're not seeing a behavior that could change. You're seeing a fixed negative label on the person.
And you said it distorts self-image and hurts self-esteem.
Definitely. Constantly labeling yourself or being labeled with words like useless, selfish, failure, it eats away at self-worth and creates a really negative, inaccurate view of yourself in the relationship.
It sounds like it also prevents appreciating the person's complexity.
Totally. When you slap a simple negative label on someone, you stop seeing them as a whole person. Their strengths, struggles, history, complexities makes real connection and empathy impossible.
You also linked it to creating stereotypes. How?
Similar to overgeneralization. If you label someone based on one trait, you might unconsciously pile on other negative assumptions associated with that label, reinforcing stereotypes and blocking real understanding.
And self-fulfilling labels. What's that?
If you internalize these negative labels, start believing you are stupid or unlovable, it can actually shape your behavior. You might act in ways that inadvertently confirm the label. Stop trying. Withdraw.
And finally, how does labeling cause a lack of empathy?
By reducing people to simple negative categories, labeling just shuts down empathy. You can't understand their unique perspective or connect deeply. The label is a barrier to their humanity.
Okay, labeling sounds incredibly limiting. Final one. Fortune telling. What's this crystal ball about?
Fortune telling is predicting negative future outcomes without enough evidence. Basically expecting the worst. And often, believing it so strongly helps make it happen another self-fulfilling prophecy.
Driven by pessimism or past bad experiences.
Could be either or both. Or just a low belief in your ability to handle things.
You used the example of predicting failure before a job interview.
Right. You go into the interview already convinced you'll fail. That belief ramps up anxiety, hurts your performance, and, well, might actually contribute to you not getting the job. Your negative prediction helped create the outcome.
So you decide the future is bad before it even happens.
Exactly. And in relationships, predicting negative outcomes just injects negativity and sets up those self-fulfilling prophecies. Constantly expecting the worst creates unnecessary anxiety and stress, which poisons the emotional well-being of the relationship.
You specifically called out unnecessary anxiety and stress.
Yes, constantly fearing bad things, my partner will definitely leave. This relationship is doomed, creates this pervasive tension and worry that hurts everyone and the connection itself.
And the self-fulfilling prophecies seem really key here too.
Huge part of it. If you predict disaster, you might act in ways that cause it. Convince your partner will leave. You might become clingy or suspicious, ironically pushing them away and creating the feared outcome.
And lastly, how does it lead to limiting relationship opportunities?
Well, if you always predict negative results, you'll avoid taking risks, right? Avoid vulnerability. Avoid trying to resolve conflicts because you know it will end badly. This fear stifles growth and leads to missed chances for deeper connection.
Wow. Okay, we've gone through all 10. It's crystal clear how these automatic negative thoughts cause so much misunderstanding, conflict, and strain in our connections.
Absolutely. And becoming aware of them, consciously noticing these patterns, that's really the first, most vital step towards healthier relationships and better mental health overall. Just learning to spot when your thoughts take these unhelpful turns.
So once we start recognizing them, what can we do? What are the practical steps?
Well, this is where things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, come in. It's a type of therapy specifically focused on identifying and changing these kinds of unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors.
And a key part of CBT is cognitive restructuring.
Exactly. Cognitive restructuring is about actively, consciously taking apart those automatic negative thoughts. You examine the evidence, challenge them, and then rebuild them into more balanced, realistic, and helpful ways of thinking.
You mentioned some specific techniques for that. Remind us of a few.
Sure, things like self-monitoring, just paying attention to your thoughts and what triggers them, questioning your assumptions, really digging into the evidence for and against a negative thought, maybe using Socratic questioning, asking yourself probing questions.
Gathering real-world evidence, too.
Yes, actively looking for proof or disproof, doing a cost-benefit analysis. What do I gain and lose by holding this thought? And importantly, generating alternative, more rational explanations for things.
It sounds like we can start this ourselves, but maybe professional help is good if these patterns are deep.
That's often true. Self-help resources and self-awareness are great starting points, definitely. But working with a therapist trained in CBT, highly recommended if these patterns are really ingrained or causing significant problems.
Why a therapist?
They offer an objective view, help pinpoint your specific distortions, and teach you effective reframing techniques tailored just for you.
What are the real payoffs? What benefits do people see when they start changing these negative thought habits?
Oh, the benefits are huge, really ripple outwards. People generally experience less stress and anxiety. Their communication skills get stronger. Relationships become healthier, more fulfilling. They often rely less on unhealthy coping habits. And there's usually a big boost in self-confidence and self-esteem.
And you said earlier, CBT isn't just for relationship issues.
No, absolutely not. It's been proven effective for a wide range of things: depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, even substance use issues. The core idea of changing unhelpful thinking is broadly applicable.
It feels important to stress, especially with something like overgeneralization, that these patterns aren't permanent. They can be changed.
Yes, exactly. Overgeneralization, like the others, is a learned pattern. And learned patterns can be unlearned, or rather, replaced with healthier ones through conscious effort. Our thoughts really do influence our feelings and actions, so changing the thoughts creates real change.
You mentioned some specific steps for tackling overgeneralization earlier. Can you recap those quickly as a concrete example of challenging a distortion?
Sure. Start with that cost-benefit analysis. What am I getting from this thought? What's it costing me? Then, actively collect evidence both for and against the thought. Try to take an outsider's perspective. What would I tell a friend thinking this? And always check, are my current emotions maybe coloring my judgment here?
And the key message is, if doing this on your own feels too hard or overwhelming,
Then seeking professional help from a CBT-trained therapist is a really smart, empowering step to take. They have the tools and expertise to guide you effectively.
okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive into cognitive distortions, what's the single biggest takeaway for our listeners?
The most crucial thing is simply that awareness is step one. Cultivating awareness of these common distortions is the absolute foundation for healthier thinking and stronger, more resilient relationships.
Right. You can't fix what you don't realize is broken, essentially.
Exactly. By learning to spot these automatic negative patterns and then actively challenging them, you open the door to more balanced perspectives, and that directly reduces the negative grip these mental traps have on your life and your connections.
That's a really positive and hopeful note to end on. So here's our final thought for you, the listener. Take a moment. Think about these 10 distortions. Which one or two maybe feel most familiar, most active in your own mind, especially in your interactions? And maybe just for the next week, try to consciously notice when one of those specific distortions pops up. Don't judge it, just notice it. And then gently, kindly question if it's really the whole truth. Just see how that tiny shift, that moment of awareness and questioning, might start to subtly change things in your relationships.